It was just a tiny slip of the blade, a single drop of crimson blood welling up on my thumb. I looked up to apologize to my billionaire boss, Victoria Vance, but the words died in my throat. She wasn't standing 40 feet away anymore. In a fraction of a human second, she was right in front of me. The air in the penthouse instantly froze. Her icy, silver eyes had turned completely, terrifyingly black. She gripped my wrist with an unnatural, bone-chilling strength. "You need to leave," she growled, her voice vibrating with a monstrous, primal hunger. But her grip only tightened. She pulled my bleeding pulse toward her parted lips, and I saw how sharp her teeth really were. The rain in Seattle never just falls. It drapes over the glass skyscrapers like a heavy gray shroud. I checked my watch for the third time as the elevator glided silently up to the 42nd floor of the Vance Tower. It was exactly 11:45 p.m. Normal billionaires didn't request urgent manuscript restorations at midnight, but Victoria Vance was not a normal billionaire. The elevator chimed, and the doors slid open into a penthouse office that looked more like a modern fortress than a place of business. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the bleeding neon lights of the city below. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the city and a single desk lamp. "You are 4 minutes late, Mia," a voice cut through the shadows. The voice was low, smooth, and entirely devoid of warmth. Victoria Vance stood by the window, a glass of dark red liquid resting in her hand. She wore a tailored black suit that fit her commanding frame perfectly. Her platinum hair was pulled back into a sharp knot, exposing the flawless, pale angle of her jawline. "The traffic on the bridge was backed up due to a collision," I said, keeping my voice steady. I pulled my leather toolkit tighter against my chest. Victoria turned slowly, and her eyes locked onto mine. They were a piercing, unnatural shade of silver gray that seemed to catch the light even in the darkness. "Excuses do not alter the passage of time," she said, stepping into the circle of lamplight. She did not walk. She moved with a fluid, terrifying grace that made no sound against the hardwood floor. "The manuscript is on the table," she added, nodding toward a heavy mahogany desk. I walked over to the desk, trying to ignore the sudden spike in my heart rate. There was an undeniable gravity to her presence that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. On the desk lay a leather-bound book from the 16th century, its pages fragile and frayed. "It requires immediate stabilization," Victoria said, standing just a few feet away from me. I could smell her perfume now, a sharp, cold blend of winter air and midnight roses. I put on my white cotton gloves and carefully opened the ancient cover. The binding is cracked, but the vellum pages are mostly intact, I murmured, examining the Latin script. Victoria didn't answer, but I could feel her gaze burning into the side of my face. It wasn't the look of a client watching a hired professional. It felt like a predator tracking the slight movement of its prey. "Why this book, Ms. Vance?" I asked, attempting to break the suffocating silence. "It belongs to a dark period of Eastern European history." "History is written by the survivors, Mia," she said softly. "Sometimes the darkest periods hold the only truths worth saving." I picked up a small silver scalpel from my kit to gently separate 2 pages that had fused together over time. The metal was cold against my fingers. My hand shook slightly, just a fraction of a millimeter, but it was enough. The sharp tip of the blade slipped through the cotton glove and sliced to the meat of my thumb. I gasped, dropping the tool. A single bead of crimson blood welled up from the cut, dark and bright against the white fabric. The air in the room instantly changed. The faint scent of roses was obliterated by the heavy metallic tang of rents and copper. I turned to apologize, but the words caught in my throat. Victoria was already standing right in front of me. She hadn't run. She had simply crossed the vast room in a fraction of a second, defying the laws of human physics. Her silver eyes had darkened to a deep, chaotic charcoal. The pupils dilated completely. "Ms. Vance?" I whispered, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. She didn't look at my face. Her gaze was locked entirely on my bleeding thumb. I saw the muscles in her jaw tighten as she took a deep, ragged breath. "You need to leave," she said, her voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a strange, primal hunger. Instead of backing away, she reached out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was like an iron vice, unyielding and impossibly cold. A jolt of pure electricity shot up my arm at her touch, making my breath hitch. It wasn't just fear. It was a sudden, overwhelming wave of recognition that defied all logic. She pulled my hand closer to her face, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, predatory light. I saw her lips part slightly, revealing teeth that looked just a little too sharp to be human. "Victoria," I breathed, using her first name without thinking. The sound of her name on my lips seemed to strike her like a physical blow. She froze, her gaze finally snapping up to meet mine. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of us moved or spoke. The rain beat a frantic rhythm against the glass windows, matching the wild pace of my pulse. I could see the internal war raging behind her cold, beautiful features. She wanted to tear me apart, yet she looked at me as if I were the only solid thing in her shifting world. "What are you?" I whispered, unable to pull my eyes away from hers. She slowly let go of my wrist, her fingers dragging across my skin with a lingering, torturous slowness. "I am your employer, Maya," she said, her voice returning to its icy, controlled mask, "and you are done for the night." She stepped back into the shadows, turning her face away from the light. "Leave the manuscript." Her voice floated from the darkness. "My driver will ensure your invoice is paid in full." My thumb was still bleeding, but the pain was entirely forgotten. I packed my tools with trembling hands, knowing that my life had just irrevocably changed. As I walked back to the elevator, I knew I would return. And from the darkness of the office, I knew she was waiting for me to do exactly that. 3 days passed since the incident at the Vance Tower. I threw myself entirely into my work at the studio. I spent hours restoring an oil painting for a local museum, hoping the routine would quiet my mind. It did not work. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those piercing silver eyes looking back at me. I still felt the phantom grip of her ice-cold fingers on my wrist. The cut on my thumb had healed almost completely, but the memory of her reaction to my blood was a fresh, pulsing wound in my mind. I had taken high-resolution photos of the 16th century manuscript before I left her office. Late Wednesday night, I pulled up the images on my computer monitor. I zoomed in on a faint, faded crest hidden deep in the margins of the Latin text. It depicted a solitary rose completely entangled with a serpent. I ran the image through the university's historical database. The search took 20 minutes, but the final results made my blood run cold. The crest belonged to the house of Valerius. They were a powerful, ruthless bloodline from Eastern Europe, widely recorded to have vanished in the late 1400 seconds. Historical rumors usually labeled them as something far worse than warlords. The texts called them monsters. I pushed away from my desk, rubbing my tired eyes in the dark office. "Vampires do not exist," I muttered to the empty room. But human beings did not cross a 40-foot room in a fraction of a second. Human beings did not have skin that felt like carved marble left out in the winter snow. A sharp knock on my studio door violently pulled me out of my thoughts. It was pouring rain outside, a brutal continuation of Seattle's gloomy streak. I walked to the front entrance and unlocked the heavy wooden door. A tall man in a pristine black suit stood under a large black umbrella. "Ms. Mia," he said, his voice entirely flat and devoid of emotion. "I am Marcus. I work directly for Ms. Vance." My stomach tightened instantly at the sound of her name. "I sent the final invoice for the consultation yesterday," I said, keeping the door half closed. "This is not about your invoice," Marcus replied smoothly. He handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope from inside his jacket. It bore the Vance Industries logo, sealed with heavy black wax. I broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cardstock. "The restoration must be completed. Pack your equipment. My driver will take you to my estate." There was no signature at the bottom. There was just the sharp, elegant handwriting that commanded absolute obedience. "I have other clients waiting," I told Marcus, trying to sound like a professional instead of a terrified prey. "Ms. Vance has bought out your entire contract for the next month," he said simply. "You are expected immediately." It was a trap, and I knew it. It was an explicit invitation into the lion's den, but the terrifying truth was that I desperately wanted to go. The invisible pull between us was a physical, throbbing quake in my chest. I packed my clothes and my restoration tools in less than 20 minutes. The drive took over an hour, leading us deep into the heavily forested outskirts of the city. The Vance estate was a massive stone mansion, completely isolated from the rest of the world. Wrought iron gates opened silently as the black car approached the grounds. Marcus escorted me inside the dimly lit foyer and pointed toward a set of double oak doors. "The library," he instructed softly. "She is waiting for you." I gripped the handle of my tool case and pushed the heavy doors open. The library was massive, lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of ancient books. A large fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting long, erratic shadows across the dark Persian rugs. Victoria was sitting in a high-backed leather chair near the fire. She was wearing a silk midnight blue robe that draped loosely over her sharp shoulders. The harsh, corporate armor of the billionaire was completely gone. In its place was something far more raw and entirely dangerous. She looked up as I closed the heavy door behind me. "You came," she said. Her voice was softer than I remembered, yet it carried across the vast room effortlessly. "You did not give me much of a choice," I replied, walking slowly toward the center of the room. I stopped a few feet away, letting the heat of the fire warm the back of my legs. Victoria stood up from her chair. The movement was so impossibly fluid it looked like a trick of the firelight. She closed the distance between us in 2 measured, silent steps. I forced myself to stand my ground, though every human instinct screamed at me to run. She stopped mere inches away, her height forcing me to tilt my head up to meet her gaze. Her silver eyes were calm today, but they held an unbearable, heavy intensity. She slowly raised her right hand. I held my breath, unable to look away. Her cold, smooth fingers brushed gently against the side of my neck. I shivered instantly, the severe contrast of her temperature against my warm skin sending a shockwave through my nerves. She traced the sharp line of my jaw, her thumb coming to rest lightly over my beating pulse point. "Your heart is racing, Mia," she whispered. I could feel the faint brush of her breath against my cheek. It smelled clean and intoxicating, like winter rain and crushed roses. "You scare me," I admitted, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to hide it. Victoria's expression shifted abruptly, a flicker of genuine pain crossing her flawless, icy features. "I could snap your neck before you even registered the pain," she stated. It was not a threat. She was simply stating a terrifying fact of nature. "But you didn't," I said, locking my eyes firmly with hers. "The other night in your office, you let me go." Her cold thumb pressed slightly harder against my rapid pulse. "Letting you walk out of that office was the hardest thing I have done in 300 years, she confessed. The weight of her words hung heavy and suffocating in the air between us. She stepped closer, eliminating the remaining space between our bodies. I could feel the unnatural cold radiating from her skin, pressing through the fabric of my clothes. "I brought you here because I cannot stay away from you," Victoria murmured, her voice dropping into a dark growl. Her silver gaze dropped slowly to my lips, "And I need to know if you are strong enough to survive me." She did not wait for my answer. Victoria leaned down, burying her face deep in the crook of my neck. She did not bite, but I felt the sharp, dangerous point of her teeth graze directly against my flesh. I gasped loudly, my hands instinctively coming up to grip her narrow waist. She was solid, unyielding, and terrifyingly real in my arms. The restoration of the ancient manuscript did not matter anymore. I had just willingly signed my life over to a beautiful monster, and God help me, I did not want to leave. The sharp point of her teeth dragged dangerously against my skin. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the agonizing pain of a bite. Instead, Victoria let out a broken, ragged exhale. She violently shoved herself away, breaking the physical contact completely. She crossed the vast library in a blur of motion, putting a heavy oak desk between us. Her chest heaved heavily, as if she had just sprinted a marathon. Her pale hands gripped the edges of the desk, the thick wood groaning under her immense strength. "Get out," she snarled, her voice completely unrecognizable. It was layered with a monstrous, primal frequency that literally shook the glass windows. I stood frozen by the fireplace, my hand instinctively clutching my own neck. "I told you I was dangerous, Mia," she said, refusing to look at me. The silver in her eyes had been entirely eclipsed by pitch black. "What is happening to you?" I asked, my feet refusing to move toward the door. "You are happening to me," Victoria whispered harshly. She finally lifted her head, and the sheer desperation in her expression stole my breath. "In my kind, there is a concept we consider a myth," she explained slowly. She forced herself to stand upright, smoothing the front of her silk robe with shaking hands. "A mate, a human whose scent and pulse completely bypass our logic and self-control." She looked away, staring deeply into the dying embers of the fire. "You are my mate, Mia, and that means my body demands to consume you completely." The terrifying words should have sent me running out into the freezing rain. Instead, they planted my feet even more firmly into the Persian rug. "I will not let my own instincts destroy you," Victoria said. Her voice was slowly regaining a fraction of its icy, corporate control. "Marcus will show you to your guest suite. Lock the heavy door." She turned her back to me entirely, staring out at the relentless storm. "Do not come out until sunrise, no matter what you hear." It was a clear, unyielding dismissal, and I knew better than to push a starving predator. I followed Marcus up the grand, sweeping staircase to a sprawling guest suite. The heavy wooden door locked behind me with a loud, definitive click. I lay fully clothed in the massive, king-sized bed, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. Sleep was a complete biological impossibility. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the phantom brush of her fangs against my throat. My blood hummed rapidly beneath my skin. It felt exactly like a live wire, vibrating with a bizarre magnetic pull. I looked at the digital clock resting on the mahogany nightstand. It was exactly 3:00 a.m. I threw off the heavy down duvet and stepped onto the cold hardwood floor. I did not bother to put on my shoes. I unlocked the bedroom door and slipped out into the silent, pitch-black hallway. The mansion was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic drumming of the storm against the roof. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but my body moved with total certainty. It felt like I was being reeled in by an invisible, unbreakable tether. I walked down a narrow, hidden service staircase that led deep into the lower levels. The air grew significantly colder and more damp with every step downward. I reached a heavy steel security door at the end of a long stone corridor. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of pale light spilling out onto the floor. I pushed it open and stepped into a subterranean, climate-controlled vault. Glass display cases held ancient weapons and manuscripts, but I ignored them completely. At the far end of the concrete room, Victoria was sitting on the floor. Her knees were pulled tightly up to her chest. She looked incredibly small and fragile, a stark contrast to the terrifying CEO I knew. She was shivering violently, her breaths coming in short, erratic gasps. I walked toward her, my bare feet making absolutely no sound on the concrete floor, but she knew instantly that I was there. "I told you to lock the door," she rasped, not lifting her head from her knees. "I did, and then I unlocked it," I replied quietly. I knelt down on the freezing floor right in front of her. She finally looked up, and my chest ached sharply at the sight. Her flawless skin was almost translucent now. The veins beneath her eyes darkened with severe hunger. She was literally starving herself to keep me safe. "You are killing yourself fighting this," I said. "If I bite you, I might not be able to stop," Victoria whispered. A single tear of pure red blood slipped down her pale cheek. It was the most heartbreakingly beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. I reached out and wiped the bloody tear away with my thumb. Her skin was like ice, but it burned fiercely against my warm touch. "I trust you," I said softly, looking directly into her blackened eyes. I didn't wait for her to formulate an argument. I rolled up the sleeve of my oversized sweater, exposing my bare wrist. I pressed the delicate inside of my wrist directly against her cold lips. Victoria gasped loudly, her entire body going rigid. "Mia, no," she whimpered, turning her face away from my skin, but her hands instinctively came up to grip my forearm. Her touch was desperate and bruising, locking my arm securely in place. "Drink," I commanded, my voice steadier than it had ever been in my life. She let out a fractured, agonizing sob, completely surrendering to her primal instinct. I felt the sharp, precise puncture of her fangs breaking through my skin. There was a brief, sharp sting, followed instantly by a massive rush of pure euphoria. A blinding white heat flooded my veins, aggressively chasing away the cold of the vault. I gasped loudly, my head falling back as the dark room spun wildly around me. It didn't feel like an act of violence or destruction. It felt like falling backward into a deep, endless, and war ocean. I felt Victoria trembling uncontrollably against me as she drank. She was taking my life force, but in return, she was pouring her ancient soul directly into mine. Her grip on my arm was fierce, yet surprisingly careful and gentle. I brought my free hand up and tangled my fingers firmly in her platinum hair. The boundary between human and monster completely dissolved in the quiet darkness of the vault. I was no longer just a hired restorer, and she was no longer untouchable Ice Queen. We were finally and irreversibly bound together. The sheer euphoria of the bite began to recede, replaced instantly by a profound, lethargic heaviness. My vision blurred at the edges, the cold concrete vault spinning completely out of focus. Victoria pulled away abruptly with a sharp, ragged gasp. She swiped the back of her hand across her mouth, smearing a thin trace of crimson across her flawless skin. Her eyes were no longer chaotic and black. They were brilliant and luminous, glowing like liquid silver in the dark room. "I took too much," she whispered, raw panic threading through her normally immovable voice. "I am fine," I tried to assure her, but the words slurred clumsily together. The floor tilted violently beneath my knees, pulling me downward into the shadows. Before gravity could claim me, incredibly strong, cold arms caught my shoulders. Victoria lifted me effortlessly against her chest, cradling my body like I weighed absolutely nothing. She pressed her thumb firmly against my bleeding wrist, and I felt a strange, icy burning sensation. She lightly kissed the puncture wounds, the unnatural properties of her saliva sealing the torn flesh instantly. Darkness aggressively swam at the very edges of my consciousness. "Sleep, Mia," her beautiful, haunting voice echoed in my fading mind. "I have you entirely." When I finally opened my eyes again, the harsh lighting of the subterranean vault was gone. I was lying in the center of a massive, heavily draped four-poster bed. The sheets were made of heavy, dark silk that felt like cool water against my skin. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick blackout curtains drawn tightly across the large windows. The entire room smelled intoxicatingly of Victoria, that distinct, addictive blend of winter chill and midnight roses. I slowly pushed myself up onto my elbows, realizing I had been changed into a soft, oversized cashmere sweater. My head did not ache, but my body felt incredibly hypersensitive to every movement and texture. "You slept for 18 hours?" A low voice spoke from the corner of the room. Victoria was sitting in a dark velvet armchair, watching me with an unblinking intensity. The rigid, tailored business suits were gone, replaced by a simple, dark turtleneck and tailored trousers. But it was her physical appearance that completely stole the breath from my lungs. She looked radiant, deeply vital, and far less like a beautiful marble statue. The translucent pallor of her skin had been replaced by a subtle, healthy warmth. "How do you feel?" she asked, rising fluidly from the chair. She crossed the bedroom in a single, soundless motion and sat on the edge of the mattress. "I feel like I drank a dozen cups of espresso," I admitted, rubbing my temple. I looked down at my right wrist, finding only 2 faint, pale pink scars where her fangs had broken my skin. Victoria traced the small marks with her index finger, her touch sending an involuntary shiver down my spine. "The blood bond alters human physiology, Mia," she explained softly, never breaking eye contact. "You will heal faster, your senses will sharpen, and you will physically fave my presence." Her silver eyes darkened slightly, a dangerous territorial possessiveness flashing within them. "You can never go back to your quiet studio in Seattle." I swallowed hard, the magnitude of her statement settling heavily in my chest. "Are you keeping me as a prisoner, Ms. Vance?" I asked, testing the boundaries of our new dynamic. Victoria leaned in close, catching my chin gently between her cold thumb and forefinger. "You gave me your blood voluntarily," she murmured, her gaze dropping to my lips. "You tethered your human soul to a creature of the dark, and you expect to just walk away?" I leaned into her touch, my heartbeat accelerating wildly against my ribs. "I didn't say I wanted to walk away," I whispered back. A fierce, incredibly beautiful smile touched the very corners of Victoria's mouth. It was a dangerous expression, belonging strictly to an apex predator who had finally claimed its prize. She leaned down, brushing her lips incredibly softly against mine in our first real kiss. It was not a bite, but the contact was just as deeply intoxicating. Her mouth was cool, tasting faintly of mint and a dark, lingering sweetness. I grabbed the front of her dark sweater, pulling her closer until her solid weight pressed against me. She groaned low in her throat, a sound of pure instinct that vibrated directly into my bones. Suddenly, a sharp, discreet knock on the heavy oak bedroom door shattered the heavy tension. Victoria pulled back instantly, the soft warmth in her face freezing over into absolute lethal stillness. "Speak," she commanded sharply, not turning her head toward the door. "My apologies, Ms. Vance." Marcus's muffled voice filtered through the thick wood. "We have received a priority communication from the European Council." Victoria's jaw clenched so tightly, I heard a faint pop of tension in the quiet room. "They are requesting an immediate audience regarding the sudden shift in your territory's energy." I felt a cold dread wash over me, completely independent of Victoria's temperature. "Tell them my territory remains secure," Victoria ordered, her voice laced with venom. She stood up from the bed, her entire demeanor returning to the terrifying, untouchable Ice Queen. "And tell the Council that if any of their agents step foot in Seattle, I will burn their ancestral estates to ashes." She looked back down at me, the terrifying coldness in her eyes softening just a fraction. "Stay in this room, Mia," she instructed quietly. "The world outside just realized you exist, and I must build a wall they can never breach." The heavy oak door closed securely, leaving me utterly alone in the cavernous bedroom. The silence in the room was absolute, yet my pulse pounded fiercely in my ears. I pushed myself off the dark silk sheets and stood slowly on the thick Persian rug. My body felt impossibly light, buzzing with an alien energy that did not belong to me. I walked toward the massive bay windows and peeked through a narrow gap in the blackout curtains. The storm outside had escalated into a raging tempest, relentlessly thrashing the ancient pine trees surrounding the estate. Down in the stone courtyard, a dozen figures in tactical black gear were rapidly securing the perimeter. They moved with that same terrifying, fluid speed that Victoria possessed. The Vance estate was no longer just a billionaire's mansion. It was a fortress preparing for a brutal siege. I let the heavy curtain fall back into place, sealing out the chaotic outside world. My newly heightened senses picked up the faint scent of old paper and leather near the fireplace. I walked over to a small mahogany writing desk tucked into the darkest corner of the room. A single, silver-framed photograph sat alone on the highly polished wood. It was black and white, capturing a much younger version of Victoria standing in front of a bombed-out European cathedral. Her eyes in the photograph held a profound, hollow emptiness that struck my chest like a physical blow. She had walked through centuries of ruin entirely alone, carrying the crushing weight of an immortal empire. Suddenly, a sharp, icy spike of pure rage flared violently in my own chest. I gasped loudly, clutching the soft fabric of my sweater directly over my beating heart. The intense, burning anger did not belong to me. It was bleeding through the new blood bond, transmitting Victoria's raw emotions directly into my nervous system. She was absolutely furious, and she was moving closer to the room. The heavy bedroom door slammed open a fraction of a second later. Victoria strode into the room, bringing a freezing rush of displaced air with her. The serene, controlled composure she wore earlier was entirely shattered. Her silver eyes were blazing with a volatile metallic fury that demanded absolute submission. She stripped off her dark winter coat and threw it carelessly onto the velvet armchair. I smelled it instantly, the sharp, unmistakable copper stench of fresh blood permeating the air. "You are hurt," I said, rushing across the room toward her without a second thought. "It is not my blood, Mia," she replied harshly, holding up a pale hand to stop my approach. Her knuckles were heavily bruised, stained with a dark, unnatural crimson that looked almost black in the dim light. The European Council sent 3 envoys to Seattle to negotiate my territory boundaries. She walked over to a Silzo basin in the corner and began furiously scrubbing the blood from her skin. They demanded to know why the vanguard of the Valerius line had suddenly shown a shift in energy. "They know about me," I whispered, the crushing reality of our situation finally settling in my bones. "They suspect," Victoria corrected sharply, drying her flawless hands with a white linen towel. "But they will never confirm those suspicions, because those 3 envoys will never return to Europe." She turned slowly to face me, the sheer brutality of her words hanging heavily in the quiet room. She had just executed 3 high-ranking political officials simply to keep my existence a secret. The sheer scale of her protective instinct was both deeply terrifying and utterly intoxicating. "You just started a war for me," I breathed, unable to look away from her intense, predatory gaze. Victoria crossed the room in a blur, closing the physical distance between us completely. She caged me against the heavy wooden post of the bed, planting both hands firmly on either side of my head. "I would burn this entire world to ash before I let them touch a single hair on your head," she growled. Her voice was heavily laced with that dark, dominant alpha frequency that vibrated straight through my spine. I looked up into her striking silver eyes, seeing the absolute, unyielding truth shining within them. She was a ruthless monster to the rest of the world, but to me, she was a fiercely devoted shield. I reached up carefully and placed my warm hand against her cold, tense jawline. She leaned into my touch instantly, closing her eyes as a ragged, exhausted sigh escaped her parted lips. The volatile rage bleeding through our blood bond slowly began to recede, replaced by a deep, aching desperation. "They will undoubtedly send more, Victoria," I said quietly, tracing my thumb gently over her sharp cheekbone. "Let them come," she murmured, opening her eyes to trap my gaze once again. "I have ruled in the shadows of this city for 400 years, Mia." She leaned down, pressing her cold forehead flush against mine in a gesture of pure intimacy. "They have completely forgotten what I am capable of when I actually have something to lose." Her cold hands slipped slowly around my waist, pulling me flush against her solid, immovable body. I wrapped my arms tightly around her neck, burying my face deeply in the curve of her shoulder. The intoxicating scent of winter air, crushed roses, and faint violence enveloped me completely. I was just a fragile, mortal human caught dead in the center of an immortal blood war. But held securely in the relentless grip of the Ice Queen, I had never felt safer in my entire life. "We need to leave Seattle tonight," Victoria stated, her voice vibrating pleasantly against my chest. "Where will we go?" I asked, perfectly willing to follow her blindly into the dark. "To the one place the Council cannot easily track us," she replied, pulling back just enough to look at my lips. "We are going back to the ruins where my bloodline first began." We left the Vance estate in a heavily armored convoy before midnight. The storm masked our departure, covering the black SUVs in a relentless sheet of freezing rain. I sat close to Victoria in the back seat, feeling the unnatural heat radiating from her immortal body. We arrived at a private airstrip on the edge of the city, where a sleek, black jet was already waiting on the tarmac. Marcus and a dozen tactical guards secured the perimeter, their faces hidden behind dark masks. Victoria walked onto the tarmac, her posture instantly shifting back to the ruthless, untouchable CEO. She barked out strict logistical orders in multiple languages, her voice slicing through the roaring jet engines. It was terrifying to watch her command a small, lethal army with such effortless authority. But when she turned back to me, the harsh lines around her mouth immediately softened. She held out her cold hand, guiding me up the metal steps and away from the heavy Seattle rain. The interior of the jet was a masterpiece of modern luxury, completely soundproofed and devoid of windows. It was designed specifically for a creature who needed to travel across time zones without ever seeing the sun. Once the heavy cabin door sealed shut, Victoria dismissed her guards to the forward section of the plane. We were entirely alone in the dim, amber-lit main cabin. I sank into a wide leather seat, suddenly exhausted by the sheer adrenaline of the escape. Victoria sat directly across from me, pouring a glass of dark amber whiskey from a crystal decanter. My guards will secure a perimeter in Romania before we land, she said quietly, handing me the glass. I took a sip, the alcohol burning a warm, grounding path down my throat. Is that where your bloodline originated? I asked, watching the amber liquid swirl in the glass. Deep in the Carpathian Mountains, she confirmed, leaning back into the dark leather shadows. The Valerius estate was built long before human maps bothered to record those valleys. I closed my eyes for a moment, noticing how intensely my hearing had sharpened since the bite. I could hear the precise mechanical hum of the jet engines and the faint, steady heartbeats of the guards 50 feet away. But above all of it, I could hear the slow, powerful rhythm of Victoria's ancient heart. Your senses are adjusting to the bond, Victoria murmured, noticing my sudden shift in focus. She stood up and moved to my side of the cabin, crouching down gracefully beside my seat. She rested her hands gently on my knees, her silver eyes looking up at me with raw intensity. You are no longer strictly human, Mia. You are carrying a piece of my immortality inside your veins. I reached down and tended my fingers into her pale, flawless hair. She let out a low, satisfied hum, leaning heavily into my gentle touch like a massive, tamed predator. I have never brought anyone to the ancestral sanctuary, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. It is a place of blood and very dark memories. Then why are we going there? I asked, tracing the cold line of her jaw. Because it is a fortress built into the very bedrock of the earth, she replied firmly. The Council's modern weapons and political influence mean absolutely nothing in the mountains. I slept for the remainder of the long flight, heavily anchored by Victoria's cold, protective presence beside me. When we finally landed, the transition from the plane to an armored helicopter was a chaotic blur of snow and roaring rotors. We flew high into the jagged, brutal peaks of the Carpathian Mountains. The landscape below was entirely desolate, a frozen wasteland completely untouched by modern civilization. The helicopter eventually descended into a deep, hidden ravine bordered by massive cliffs. At the base of the mountain, built directly into the dark stone, stood a pair of colossal iron doors. They were heavily rusted and covered in centuries of thick, frozen vines. But as we approached on foot, hidden hydraulic motors hummed to life, pulling the ancient iron open. "Welcome to the end of the world, Mia," Victoria said softly, pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders. We walked out of the freezing blizzard and into the grand foyer of the subterranean fortress. It was a breathtaking collision of ancient history and cutting-edge military technology. Thick stone pillars from the 12th century supported ceilings lined with modern biometric sensors. Rows of ancient swords and armor stood in glass cases right next to heavily encrypted server racks. Victoria led me past the heavily armed guards and down a long, torchlit corridor. We entered a massive circular chamber that looked very much like a throne room. In the center of the room sat a massive chair carved entirely from black obsidian. "The council fears me because I am the last living heir to this throne," Victoria explained, staring at the black stone. "The Valerius line was bred to rule, to conquer, and to wipe out weaker bloodlines entirely." She turned to face me, her silver eyes reflecting the flickering flames of the wall torches. "They think my isolation in Seattle was a sign of weakness, or a long, slow retirement." She stepped closer, wrapping her arms securely around my waist and pulling me against her chest. They did not realize I was simply waiting to find the one thing in this world actually worth fighting for. I looked up into the face of a ruthless, immortal warlord, seeing only the desperate devotion of a woman deeply in love. The war with the Council was inevitable, and it would undoubtedly be bloody. But standing here in the dark heart of her ancient empire, I knew we were going to win. Time lost all meaning inside the subterranean fortress. There were no windows to track the rising or setting of the sun. The only constants were the hum of the servers and the relentless howling of the blizzard outside. 3 days had passed since we arrived in the Carpathian Mountains. The blood bond between Victoria and me had deepened into a profound physical tether. I no longer just heard the faint sounds of the fortress. I felt them vibrating directly in my teeth. My reflexes had become frighteningly sharp. When a crystal glass slipped from the dining table that morning, I caught it mid-air before I even registered moving. Victoria watched my development with a mixture of dark pride and heavy concern. She spent hours in the underground training rings, burning off the aggressive, territorial energy that came with claiming a mate. I found her there alert one afternoon, striking a heavy reinforced bag with terrifying concussive force. She wore only athletic wrappings on her hands, her silver hair tied back tightly. Sweat glistened lightly on her pale shoulders, a rare display of physical exertion for an immortal. "You are distracted, Mia," she said, catching the heavy bag without turning around. "I can hear the blood rushing through your veins from across the room." I stepped onto the padded mat, the air heavy with the scent of her exertion and crushed roses. "I am trying to dial the noise down," I admitted, rubbing my temples. "Everything is just too loud." Victoria turned and walked slowly toward me, her breathing completely steady despite the brutal workout. "You are fighting your new instincts instead of surrendering to them," she instructed. She stopped inches away, the heat radiating from her skin wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. "Close your eyes," she commanded softly. I obeyed, instantly plunging into a chaotic sea of overlapping sounds and smells. "Focus only on my voice," Victoria murmured, stepping closer until our chests almost touched. "Filter out the hum of the lights. Filter out the footsteps of the guards in the upper hall." She raised her wrapped hands, gently placing her cold palms against my cheeks. "Find my heartbeat, Mia. Anchor yourself entirely to it." I took a deep breath, pushing past the overwhelming static of the environment. Slowly, the chaotic noise began to fade into the background. In the center of the silence, I found the slow, powerful, and hypnotic rhythm of her chest. Thump, thump, thump. "I have it," I whispered, opening my eyes to meet her piercing silver gaze. The predatory intensity in her expression made my breath hitch. She looked at me not just as a teacher, but as a starving creature looking at its absolute devotion. "You belong to my blood now," Victoria growled low in her throat. She gripped my waist and effortlessly lifted me onto the padded edge of the training ring. She stepped between my legs, pressing her cold, hard body flush against mine. I gasped at the sudden, overwhelming friction, my hands immediately gripping her bare shoulders. "You are my anchor," I replied, leaning down to press my lips against the rapid pulse point on her neck. Victoria let out a deep, shuddering groan, her hands sliding up my spine to tangle fiercely in my hair. The kiss that followed was desperate, hungry, and completely devoid of her usual icy restraint. We were spiraling into a dangerous, intoxicating gravity, completely losing ourselves in the quiet training room. But the absolute silence of the fortress was suddenly, violently shattered. A harsh, blaring red siren echoed through the stone corridors, accompanied by the strobing flash of emergency lights. Victoria pulled back instantly, the deep desire in her eyes immediately freezing over into pure, lethal rage. "Perimeter breach," she stated, her voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm. She stepped back from the ring, tearing the athletic tape from her knuckles with a sharp, violent motion. "The Council's vanguard has arrived." Marcus burst through the heavy steel doors of the training room a second later, fully armed in tactical gear. "My queen," he said, bowing his head quickly. "They are hitting the southern ridge, heavily armed immortals." Victoria did not blink. "Activate the automated defenses. Prepare the elite guard for direct engagement." She turned back to me, her expression a flawless mask of the ancient warlord. "Marcus will escort you to the inner vault," she ordered. "The titanium doors can withstand a bunker buster bomb." "I am not going to hide in a cage while you fight a war," I protested, my newly heightened anger flaring. Victoria stepped close and grabbed my face, her grip firm and completely uncompromising. "You are the only thing in this universe I cannot afford to lose," she said fiercely. "If they get to you, Mia, I will slaughter every living thing on this mountain, including myself." Her words left no room for argument. She kissed me hard one last time, tasting of adrenaline and pending violence, before disappearing into the corridor. Marcus led me deep into the bedrock, sealing me inside the massive family archives. The heavy vault doors locked behind me with a resounding, final thud. I was alone in the quiet dock, surrounded by centuries of Valerius history. I paced the stone floor, listening to the muffled, distant echoes of gunfire and collapsing rock above. I could feel Victoria's cold fury vibrating through our blood bond, sharp and relentless. But I refused to be just a fragile human liability waiting for rescue. I looked at the ancient rows of books and scrolls lining the vault walls. I was a master restorer. My entire life was dedicated to uncovering secrets buried by time. I walked over to the center table and opened my leather toolkit. I pulled out the high-resolution scans of the 16th century manuscript that started this entire nightmare. If the council was so terrified of Victoria's bloodline, the answer had to be hidden deep in the text. I just had to find it before the vanguard tore down the gates. The subterranean vault violently shuddered beneath my boots. A heavy layer of ancient dust drifted down from the stone ceiling, coating the mahogany table in grau powder. Another concussive blast echoed from the surface, vibrating deeply into my bones. I ignored the terrifying sounds of the war raging above my head. My eyes were locked entirely on the high-resolution tablet screen, displaying the 16th century manuscript. I zoomed in on the intricate, faded margins that surrounded the heavy Latin text. My newly heightened senses noticed something I had entirely missed in my Seattle studio. The ink density in the negative space of the page was completely inconsistent. I quickly opened a forensic imaging program and applied an infrared digital filter to the raw scans. The standard religious text instantly dissolved from the bright screen. Beneath the Latin scripture lay a massive, highly complex geometric diagram. It was a sprawling network of ancient runes, all connected to the central crest of the House of Valerius. My eyes quickly scanned the translated runic footnotes at the bottom of the digital page. It was not a political treaty or a recorded family history. It was a weapon. The document outlined a localized blood magic ritual designed to completely suppress the healing abilities of rival bloodlines. It was an area of effect subjugation protocol built into the foundation of the mountain. If activated, it would strip the Council's vanguard of their immortal advantages, leaving them as fragile as ordinary humans. Suddenly, a blinding, searing agony ripped through my left shoulder. I screamed loudly, dropping the heavy digital tablet onto the stone floor. My knees gave out completely, and I collapsed hard against the sharp edge of the wooden table. I clutched my shoulder, gasping frantically for air, but there was no physical wound on my sweater. The pain did not belong to my body. It was bleeding directly through the bond from Victoria. I closed my eyes and focused on the terrifying emotional static rushing aggressively through my veins. I felt the freezing, agonizing bite of weaponized silver tearing deeply into her immortal flesh. The Council had not just sent standard tactical soldiers to the fortress. They had brought heavy artillery specifically engineered to slaughter ancient vampires. Victoria was incredibly strong, but she was entirely outnumbered and taking heavy damage. A cold, paralyzing dread settled heavily in the very pit of my stomach. I dragged myself back up to the table and stared fiercely at the runic diagram on the cracked screen. The activation sequence required two distinct, non-negotiable elements. It needed the geographical center of the Valerius stronghold, which was this exact subterranean vault. And it required a willing sacrifice of human blood from a creature tethered to the sovereign's soul. The ancient texts called it the ultimate devotion of the mate. I did not hesitate for a single solitary second. I reached into my leather toolkit and pulled out my sharpest silver scalpel. The metal felt incredibly cold and heavy in my trembling right hand. I dropped to my knees on the smooth stone floor in the exact center of the dark vault. I pressed the sharp edge of the blade firmly into the palm of my left hand and pulled it quickly across my skin. The cut was deep, and the sharp pain served to anchor my racing mind. Hot, crimson blood welled up instantly, spilling over my fingers and dropping onto the cold, ancient stone. I used my bleeding hand to carefully trace the central sigil of the Valerius crest directly onto the floor. I drew the thick serpent violently entangled with the solitary rose. I quickly connected the outer runic circles, following the exact geometric proportions memorized from the digital scan. My vision began to blur slightly at the edges from the rapid blood loss and adrenaline. But the moment my bloody fingers closed the final circle of the diagram, the air inside the vault changed. The heavy stone floor practically hummed beneath my bare knees. My fresh blood did not dry or soak naturally into the porous rock. It began to emit a faint, pulsing crimson glow that instantly illuminated the darkest corners of the room. I placed both of my hands directly into the center of the glowing, wet sigil. I closed my eyes and aggressively pushed every ounce of my love, desperation, and human warmth directly into the blood bond. I forced the ancient magic straight up through the bedrock, targeting the cold, fading anchor of Victoria's heart. The physical backlash was instantaneous and completely overwhelming. A massive shockwave of pure, invisible energy exploded outward from the floor of the vault. It violently rattled the glass display cases and extinguished every remaining torch in the room. The agonizing, sympathetic pain in my phantom shoulder vanished in a heartbeat. It was replaced by a terrifying, euphoric surge of absolute power that nearly stopped my human heart. The brutal battle above ground completely shifted in a matter of seconds. The muffled, rhythmic sounds of tactical gunfire abruptly ceased. They were replaced by the horrifying, wet sounds of heavy Kevlar armor being torn apart by bare hands. I heard immortal screams echoing loudly down the distant stone corridors. Victoria was no longer fighting a desperate defensive war against the vanguard. She was slaughtering them with the absolute, terrifying authority of a dark god. I slumped forward against the cold stone floor, utterly exhausted, and holding my bleeding hand against my chest. The crimson glow of the sigil slowly faded away, leaving me in total, suffocating darkness. Minutes dragged by in absolute, heavy silence. Then, the heavy hydraulic locks of the vault door finally disengaged with a loud hiss. The massive titanium door groaned loudly as it was pulled violently open from the outside. The bright, straggling emergency lights from the hallway aggressively spilled into the dark vault. Victoria stood perfectly still in the open doorway. Her dark, tactical clothing was completely soaked in the thick black blood of her enemies. A jagged, broken silver spear was embedded deeply into her left shoulder, but she did not even seem to notice the fatal wound. Her silver eyes were blazing with a volatile, unholy light that belonged to a pure apex predator. She looked entirely terrifying. She looked exactly like the absolute monster the historical texts claimed she was. But when her glowing eyes finally found me kneeling weakly on the floor, the terrifying monster instantly vanished. She crossed the vast room in a fraction of a second, dropping hard to her knees right beside me. "Mia," she breathed, her voice cracking with a desperate, heavy terror I had never heard before. Victoria dropped heavily to her knees on the cold stone floor, the impact echoing sharply in the silent vault. She did not care about the tactical gear soaked in the dark, thick blood of the vanguard. She did not even flinch at the jagged silver spear deeply impaled in her own left shoulder. Her glowing silver eyes were locked entirely on my bloody, trembling left hand. "What did you do, Mia?" she choked out, her normally immovable voice fracturing into pieces. She reached out with hands that had just torn armored immortals to shreds, trembling as she cupped my wrist. Her touch was unbelievably gentle, as if she were handling the most fragile glass in the universe. "You were dying," I whispered, my throat dry and exhausted from the massive surge of ancient magic. "I could feel the silver burning you through the bond." Victoria let out a broken, agonizing sound that was halfway between a sob and a growl. She brought my bleeding palm up to her face, closing her eyes tightly. Without a moment of hesitation, she pressed her cold, soft lips directly against the deep, jagged cut. I gasped sharply as the familiar icy electrical current shot straight up my arm. The pain vanished completely in a fraction of a second, replaced by a soothing, deep numbness. Her unnatural saliva worked instantly, knitting my torn human flesh back together perfectly. When she slowly pulled away, there was only a faint, pale pink line left on my palm. "You activated a blood subjugation protocol meant only for the ancient high priests," Victoria said, her breath ghosting across my skin. She opened her eyes, and the terrifying metallic glow had faded back into a deep, desperate silver. "It could have stopped your human heart entirely, Mia. It could have burned your soul to ash." "But it didn't," I replied fiercely, refusing to break eye contact with her. I pushed myself up into a kneeling position, ignoring the lingering dizziness in my head. I am tethered to you, Victoria. That means your wars are now my wars. I reached out with my uninjured hand, gently tracing the sharp line of her blood-stained jaw. She leaned heavily into my touch, a shuddering sigh escaping her chest as she closed her eyes again. But my hand did not stop at her jawline. I moved my fingers down to the heavily armored collar of her tactical vest, resting my hand right next to the embedded silver spear. The air immediately around the weapon literally hissed, the holy metal violently rejecting her immortal flesh. "This needs to come out," I stated firmly. Victoria's eyes snapped open, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing her beautiful features. "It is heavily barbed, Mia," she warned quietly. "It will not be pleasant to witness." "I just used my own blood to rewrite the magical foundation of a mountain," I reminded her softly. "I can handle it." I wrapped both of my hands firmly around the jagged, blood-soaked shaft of the silver weapon. "Hold exactly still," I commanded, my voice echoing with a surprising, quiet authority. Victoria did not move a single muscle. She simply watched me with an expression of absolute, profound devotion. I took a deep breath, braced my boots against the stone floor, and pulled upward with every ounce of my remaining strength. There was a sickening, wet, tearing sound as the murdered silver violently exited her shoulder. Victoria let out a low, guttural hiss of pain, her hands gripping my waist tightly to steady herself. I tossed the heavy, bloodied spear onto the floor, the metal clattering loudly into the darkness. Almost immediately, the terrifying, fatal wound in her shoulder began to rapidly stitch itself closed. Within seconds, the smooth, pale skin of the immortal warlord was completely flawless once again. The heavy, paralyzing tension that had flooded the subterranean fortress finally broke. Victoria surged forward, wrapping her incredibly strong arms entirely around my body. She buried her face deep into the crook of my neck, breathing in my scent like I was pure oxygen. "You foolish, brave, absolutely terrifying creature," she murmured against my skin, her cold lips sending shivers down my spine. I wrapped my arms tightly around her shoulders, burying my fingers securely into her platinum hair. "They will not come back," I said, stating it as an absolute fact. "No," Victoria agreed, her voice dropping into that dark, rumbling alpha frequency that vibrated directly into my bones. She pulled back just enough to look deeply into my eyes. The council felt the resonance of the blood magic. They know exactly what happened here tonight. She gently brushed a stray lock of hair away from my forehead, her silver eyes filled with undeniable awe. They know that the vanguard of the Valerius line has finally found her queen. The word hung heavily in the quiet vault, carrying the weight of 1,000 ancient promises. I was no longer just a hired art restorer from Seattle. I was the anchor to an immortal empire, the absolute equal to the most dangerous creature in the dark world. Victoria stood up fluidly, effortlessly, pulling me up onto my feet right alongside her. She did not let go of my hand. Instead, she intertwined her cold, smooth fingers tightly with mine. "Come," she said softly, leading me toward the open titanium doors of the vault. "The storm is passing." We walked together out of the subterranean archives and back into the long stone corridors. The aftermath of the battle was brutal, the ancient halls heavily scarred by modern gunfire. But as we entered the massive, circular throne room, the heavy iron doors at the entrance were slightly ajar. The raging blizzard outside had finally broken. The first faint gray rays of the morning sun were piercing through the heavy clouds over the Carpathian Mountains. The light spilled across the cold stone floor, reaching the base of the black obsidian throne. Victoria stopped in the center of the room, turning to face me entirely. She brought my hand to her lips, pressing a deep, lingering kiss to my knuckles. "My life, my territory, and my absolute devotion belong to you," she vowed, her voice echoing perfectly in the grand hall. I smiled, stepping forward to close the remaining distance between us. I wrapped my arms around her neck and pulled the Ice Queen down into a slow, breathless kiss. The world outside could keep its politics, its wars, and its fleeting human history. Here, in the dark and quiet ruins of eternity, we had found exactly where we belonged. We were completely, beautifully, and irreversibly bound. This story proves that true power isn't about ruling an ancient empire with an iron fist. It's about the terrifying, beautiful courage of a fragile human willing to bleed for her monster. Victoria built a fortress of ice over 4 centuries, but it only took one drop of Mia's blood to melt it completely. If this intoxicating journey of forbidden blood pacts and fierce alpha devotion kept you on the edge of your seat, please give this video a massive thumbs up. Your support is the heartbeat of Taylor's secret library, letting me know you crave more high-stakes, premium GL stories. Make sure to hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss a single entry in our collection. Next week, we're pulling a new file from the archives, a modern Omegaverse thriller where a ruthless corporate alpha discovers her most hated business rival is actually an unregistered Omega, and her fated mate. The enemies to lovers tension will be entirely off the charts. What was your absolute favorite moment in today's epic tale? Was it the heart-stopping first encounter in the rainy penthouse, or the legendary climax where Mia drew the ancient runic circle to save her queen? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Until next time, embrace the shadows, trust your instincts, and I'll see you in the next chapter of Taylor's Secret Library.